In this slideshow, we're going to be looking at the rise and fall of King Saul, which also coincides with the rise of David. Saul's story is a tragic one, and it starts out in glory and devolves into abject horror. Now, as we look at Saul, let's be reminded of the German mystic historians who wrote this and the perspective from which they're writing, or at least from which they're compiling and editing this work. They want to answer that question, why? Why did we lose it all? Remember from last week, the Assyrian, the Babylonian, the Persian invasions, which will then also go into the Greek invasions, which are horrendous, which we'll talk about later. All of these things left the Hebrews as a people wondering, why did this happen to us? And if you'll remember, they see it as God's punishments for things that they did and things that they did not do. The two main things, one, apostasy, turning their backs on God, and secondly, social injustice, not caring for the marginalized of their society, not caring for the orphan and the widow, and many of these topics that are talked about both in the Hebrew prophets but also in the Jewish mystic histories. Now it's important here to add a caveat as we venture forth. Within the Catholic Church, we don't see a God that punishes peoples wholesale due to apostasy and these sorts of things. If that were the case, why throughout history would God-fearing, shall we say, nations have prospered and done well? Sure, they have also fallen, but so have Christian nations. But this is certainly how the ancient Hebrews saw it, and in wrestling with how they lost everything, they're going to look at being, they're going to be looking at examples such as Saul's. What we see in Saul's example is going to hearken back to Samuel's pleading that they not take on a king because of all the trouble that a king will be. The Hebrews, according to the biblical narrative, should have trusted in God and a theocracy and not have demanded this monarchy, and those problems arise very early. But before the problems arise, Saul goes through a golden period. Let's go to the next slide. After Saul is installed as king, after that horrible coronation speech that Samuel gives, a rather bitter coronation speech that we discussed in the last session, he is able to do the things that the people want him to do. He starts by uniting the tribes, not total unification, but he's able to bring them together in a way that they've never been brought together before. In 1 Samuel 11, he gives a rousing speech and slaughters an animal and cuts it into pieces and basically says, if we don't unify, we'll be as divided as this animal, or the same will happen to us. And he gets unity, and you know what? He starts taking on the enemies of newly formed Israel, and he wins. Battle after battle, he starts winning. What Saul is doing is exactly what the people had hoped for. As Saul is able to defeat those very frightening Philistines, the ones who are the heavy infantry who can come up after them if they run into the mountains, his ability to defeat Canaanites as well wins him great popularity, and you can imagine how Samuel is looking in the eyes of the people now. That old guy who had told them all about not wanting a king, how the king would lead to trouble. Well, everything was coming up roses, and Saul's popularity skyrocketed. But Saul is human. And we know what can happen to humans when we receive a lot of praise, when we receive a lot of attention, when we have many successes in succession. Our heads can get big, can't they? Think of junior high sports, that culmination of the pressures and joys of the sports world with all the awkwardness that comes with adolescence. Take a junior high basketball team, and you've got one kid who can really make the shots, who can really do all the things that are making the team successful. What happens to that kid at that delicate, impressionable point in life? Quite often, their head swells, and this causes all sorts of problems, including the rejection of the other players who are supposed to be working together with that kid. In my junior high, when that happened, the other players backed away and let the kid try to be a team of his own. It didn't work out too well for him, and he quickly learned his lesson. Well, King Saul is working alongside God here. And Saul's getting a big head. And God, in response, is going to pull back, eventually, in a most horrifying way. But let's get to the first real sin of Saul here. During a battle with the Philistines, Saul makes a grievous error. Before going into battle, the two armies would make sacrifices to their gods in the ancient Near East, because why wouldn't you, right? You want all the help you can get when going into battle. And battles were set up at certain times. They were very orderly that way. In agrarian societies, you have to plant at certain times, you have to harvest at certain times, and both sides are in the same boat because they live in relatively the same region. So you would have a certain time that you would meet for war, kind of like I'll meet you by the bike racks at lunchtime, right, in grade school. So they would have a certain time and place they would meet, and they would show up. Well, before the battle, each side would sacrifice to their god or gods and ask for divine favor in the battle. Well, here we've got a situation in which we've got Samuel, who is the religious authority in Israel, and Saul, who is the political authority in Israel. Because of their separate purposes, it is Samuel's job to do the sacrifice. That's his divine right. Before this battle, Samuel informs Saul that he's going to be gone for 7 days and that he'll be back in time for the battle. Saul's okay with this, and so Samuel goes and does his thing, but he's late coming back. And after not showing up for a while, it's starting to get a bit embarrassing. The other side has already done their sacrifice. They're all raring to go. And there's King Saul with his hands in his pockets, waiting for his priest, and it probably looks pretty foolish. So he thinks, oh, what the heck? He goes ahead and he does the sacrifice. As in any good story, right after he does the sacrifice, who shows up but the priest Samuel and prophet Samuel? Prophet Samuel shows up and wants to know what on earth Saul has just done. Samuel asks Saul in 1 Samuel 13, verse 11, "What have you done?" Saul replied, "When I saw that the people were slipping away from me, and that you did not come within the days appointed, and that the Philistines were mustering at Michmash, I said, now the Philistines will come down upon me in Gilgal, and I will be entreated, at Gilgal, and I have not entreated the favor of Yahweh. So I forced myself and offered the burnt offering." Samuel said to Saul, "You have done foolishly. You have not kept the commandment of Yahweh your God, which he commanded you. Yahweh would have established your kingdom over Israel forever, but now your kingdom will not continue. Yahweh has sought out a man after his own heart, and Yahweh has appointed him to be ruler over his people, because you have not kept what Yahweh commanded you." And Samuel left and went on his way from Gilgal. The rest of the people followed Saul to join the army. They went up from Gilgal toward Gibeah. Even us Old Testament scholars trip on these. Gibeah. It's easier if I see it in the Hebrew, of Benjamin. There's another instance as well in which Saul is supposed to put his conquered victims all to death, including the king and all the livestock, and he doesn't. He keeps the livestock because they're valuable and keeps the king to make an alliance with him. These two things are the big mess-ups that Saul does, and Yahweh is going to burn him for them. What he has essentially done here is reached beyond his power. In the sacrifice story, think of two pillars. These are the two pillars of Israel governance. One pillar is the kingly pillar, the other is the priestly pillar. Saul's job, he was ordained by God to be the political ruler and do things that entails. Samuel's job is to be the priestly ruler and do the things that entails. But now, Saul has reached from his pillar over to the priestly pillar and grabbed them both like grabbing a live wire. And it will torment him, and it will lead to his demise. God is not simply going to smite Saul over a period of a number of years. God is going to pick Saul apart mentally. He's going to drive him into a horrible, languishing madness until it leads to his end. Now, this is a great story in and of its own, but let's consider it in the context of the Judaistic history of those people sitting down after the exile. They've returned back to Israel and wondering what the heck had happened. We get a first piece of that puzzle being put together about how enemies had led people, or how rulers had led people astray, how rulers could be corrupted by pride. And that example is going to go on throughout the story of Saul. This, so far, is proving a very good story to lean on about not trusting in God, but trusting in their own devices. So, as Saul is falling, who is going to take his place? As Saul declines, another will simultaneously rise. That other is to be a young boy named David. Here we've got an example on this slide of just how far David permeates into culture and society today. The Ace of Spades card is known as the David card, the most powerful card in the deck. Now, I know you can't answer me in this video PowerPoint, but can anyone see in here an indication that this might be David? You can pause it here and take a moment to look if you like. If you said the harp, you're correct. David is known as a great musician and poet, which we'll be talking about in a moment, and the lyre indicates David. On other decks of cards, you'll have the Star of David on there. The Star of David also is on the state flag of the modern state of Israel and is an important religious symbol that harkens back to David. Very interesting fact about the Star of David. Let's go to the next slide. The Star of David has its roots in ancient Egypt, which is very interesting, I think. It's an ancient symbol of monarchy, and it's two pyramids. You get the upright pyramid, symbolizing the base of the king's power on earth and reaching up into the heavens, into the gods in the Egyptian context, and the upside-down triangle, symbolizing the god's power up in the heavens, reaching down and touching to earth and ordaining the king. So you get this ancient monarchic symbol from Egypt that then becomes an ancient Hebrew symbol of King David. So let's learn a little bit more about David's character. In the book of 1 Samuel, David is portrayed as a heroic figure, and almost without exception. The Germanistic historian gives a whole lot of loving to King David with a big propaganda push. The kid can do no wrong. He's pious, he's humble, he's brave, he's got all these wonderful attributes. He's your classic hero character. Furthermore, David is a wonderfully unusual choice to be tapped to be king. David is the youngest son of Jesse. You might recognize that name from the Christmas carol/hymn, O Come, Emmanuel, in which the root of Jesse's tree, which from Matthew traces Joseph's lineage all the way back to David, which is interesting to me because Joseph's not supposed to be Jesus' dad, right? That's for another course. But at any rate, he's the youngest son, and that means that he is he really shouldn't have anything special. You had a situation, as we talked about with Noah and the flood at the end there, where Noah gets drunk and Ham walks in on him in the tent, where Ham was trying to do a power play to rise up above his brothers and Noah. Here we actually see God doing this for David. It depends where you look in the Bible. There's different accounts. Again, the Bible is a mishmash of different stories from different areas. So in one of the stories, David has 7 older brothers, and the other he has 6, and he's the 7th son. It depends where you look. But regardless, he is going to leapfrog all of them and his father Jesse to be the king of Israel. So in the story, Samuel comes and he's told that it's in Jesse's lineage that he's to find the next king. And he goes there and Jesse says, well, yeah, here are my sons. And Samuel looks at him and says, no, none of this is right, doing his incantations or what have you to determine which was to be the king. And he's like, are you sure you don't have any more sons? He says, well, there's David. He's the youngest. He's out watching the sheep. will bring him to me. And sure enough, it's David. And even within this moment, David takes no pride. He is extremely humble when he's told that he is the choice. Another famous characteristic of David is his musicianship and his poetry writing. Not only is David an exceptional musician and poet, he's a magical musician and poet. His music and poetry have magical properties and powers that can do things as drive evil spirits away. This makes him invaluable and really sets up his story with Saul, because it is through an evil spirit that Yahweh is tormenting Saul and leading him to insanity. In the ancient world, insanity or mental illnesses were understood as the work of demons. They didn't have psychology or psychiatric help in the way that we do today. That's how they understood the world. But Yahweh sends an evil spirit to torment Saul, lead him to his demise. And it's David, through his music, who is going to help him. Now, this raises the question, why is God playing with evil spirits? Well, again, in the Old Testament, you don't have a devil. You don't have that other deity known or realized or existing, whatever your view is on it, until the New Testament. Then you definitely have your God of good, and then your, I guess, devil, like a supernatural being, we'll call it, that handles the evil stuff. So it's Yahweh who controls evil spirits in the Old Testament understanding of religion. I shouldn't say the Old Testament understanding of religion, the ancient Hebrew understanding of religion. So let's take a look at how David and King Saul finally come to cross paths, and we find it in 1 Samuel 16 on the next slide. The passage reads, "Now the spirit of Yahweh departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from Yahweh tormented him. And Saul's servant said to him, 'See now, an evil spirit from God is tormenting you. Let our Lord now command the servants who attend you to look for someone who is skillful in playing the lyre. And when the evil spirit from God is upon you, he will play it, and you will feel better.' So Saul said to his servants, 'Provide for me someone who can play well, and bring him to me.' One of the young men answered, 'I have seen a son of Jesse, a Bethlehemite, who is skillful in playing, a man of valor, a warrior, prudent in speech, and a man of good presence, and Yahweh is with him.'" What an interesting passage. Let's break it down a little bit. First, we've got a problem with what we would consider today mental illness. There, it's an evil spirit sent by God. But secondly, it's the introduction by the young man in verse 18 that intrigues me. "I have seen a son of Jesse, a Bethlehemite, who is skillful in playing, yes, a man of valor." What does that mean in this situation? Someone who is brave, someone who is bold. From that, you could get perhaps trustworthy. A warrior. Now, this just isn't true. At this point, David isn't a warrior at all. He's a little pipsqueak who watches sheep in the fields. Yeah, he has to fight off animals, but a warrior, not a bit. As far as we know, he has not received any sort of training of that type, and it would be highly unlikely that the youngest son of Jesse would have. What we're seeing here is authors much later looking back and setting up this introduction. And from their future perspective, David is a great warrior because that's what he becomes. But at this point, no. That's the Duramistic historians really pushing the propaganda here for King David. That's a large part of what they're doing in this literary section of the Bible, is promoting David's power. Prudent in speech. This is an important one. Because if you're dealing with a king who's going mad, you want to have someone who's prudent in speech. Prudent in speech meaning thoughtful about what he says, considerate, also can keep a secret very well, doesn't go blabbing about. Boy, you should have seen what King Saul was doing in the chambers the other day. Wow, is that guy mad? Or being foolish in what you say by saying directly to the king, "King Saul, why are you talking to your shoulder?" Things that might upset the king. So this is a guy, when he goes in front of the king, is unlikely to upset him, and also can keep a secret when he leaves the chambers. And a man of good presence. He's just a good guy to be around. If you're throwing a party on Friday night, you definitely want to have David there because everyone has fun when David's around, right? He's just one of those people that's really easy to get on with. Also a good characteristic to have around a king who's slowly going mad. And Yahweh is with him. The problem that Saul is facing here is Yahweh's pulling away from Saul. So if he can have a man with whom Yahweh is with, then that can help Saul, hopefully. Well, indeed, this is what happens. David comes and he plays his magical music and sings his magical poems, and it does quell the evil spirit, and it's driven away, giving Saul the much needed relief that he's been seeking. When David's doing his music, Saul can think clearly. And from this, a relationship starts between Saul and his servant David. And Saul comes to love David like a son, and David comes to love King Saul like a father. It's a beautiful relationship between the two, and it extends to Saul's heir apparent Jonathan. Jonathan and David become like brothers, very close indeed. And it's a wonderful relationship that sparks, but a relationship, like all things in Saul's life, that will end in tragedy. And while Saul is collapsing under the weight of God's punishment, David is promoted as a legendary hero who will rise higher and higher. This highlights David's divine favor for David repeatedly. Time and again, this comes through. And what's really interesting about the propaganda push to me is that David is revealed to Samuel as Saul was, except with Saul, David was completely against the prospect. But there's absolutely no reluctance on Saul's part of anointing David as king. Saul loves the idea of David as king, which seems very unrealistic considering the earlier part. Maybe he had a change of heart. Maybe this is setting up the next phase of the story. Maybe it's a bit of both. Regardless, one of the tragedies that comes out of this is Saul loses favor with David, and David's favor with God increases. This causes a rift in Saul's mind and his relationship with Saul, or in Saul's mind and his relationship with David, as we will see play out after the battle of David and Goliath. David's popularity with Saul for being able to quell the spirit, the evil spirit sent by God, and also just the general relationship that they've been building up, brings David closer into Saul's inner circle, and David becomes his armor bearer. Has the job of going with the king in battle and handing him the weapons he wants when he wants them, and all that sort of thing. It's a very esteemed position. But then this one battle happens with the Philistines. Now, there was a technique in warfare in the ancient world that cut down casualties. And what would happen is, instead of having everyone go in and fight one another, both armies would pick their best warrior. And the best warrior would go into the center, and they would fight one another to the death. And whoever won, as a point of honor, the other side would have to surrender to them. Basically, it's saying, look, we'll send out our best, and that's a pretty good predictor of which side would win in the end. When you consider that lifespans were so short in the ancient world, again, most people didn't make it past the age of 3, labor was scarce, and a wholesale slaughter of war could definitely affect the ability to produce food and all of that sort of stuff, threatening the rest of the population. So this was a humane way of going forward and avoiding mass casualties. That's what's happening in the story of David and Goliath. And there's this giant named Goliath, right? Okay, interesting fact I have to insert here. I'm actually taller than Goliath was supposed to be. So Goliath was supposed to be about, I think, somewhere between 6'7" and 6'8", and I'm 6'9". And at least at this point, if you Google Matthew Coomber and Goliath, you'll come up with a page. There was a PhD student in New Zealand who did his dissertation on monsters of the Old Testament, and one of those was Goliath, and he wrote a thing on how I'm taller than Goliath, and there's a little measurement thing there and everything. It's pretty funny. But at any rate, The Philistines have sent out Goliath, this giant, and 6'7", 6'8", when the average person was maybe around 5 feet tall. That is a giant. Sends him out, and he's waiting for the Hebrews to send out, or the Israelites to send out their warrior. But it's not coming. You can imagine the scene as the Philistines mock the Hebrews. What? You guys have this one God who's supposed to be protecting you and all-powerful and universal, and you're too afraid to send out any of your warriors against our Goliath? Well, David sees this taunting and teasing and has had enough, and he volunteers for the job. And in 1 Samuel 17, David makes it known that he's volunteering to do this. We find, when the words that David spoke were heard, they repeated them before Saul, and he sent for him. David said to Saul, "Let no one's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight this Philistine." Saul said to David, "You are not able to go against the Philistine to fight with him, for you are just a boy, and he has been a warrior since his youth," again contradicting the earlier statement that David was already a warrior when being introduced to Saul. But David said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep sheep for his father, and whenever a lion or a bear came and took a lamb from the flock, I went after it and struck it down, rescuing the lamb from its mouth, and if it turned against me, I would catch it by the jaw, strike it down, and kill it. Your servant has killed both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised," we'll come back to that, "Philistine shall be one of them, since he has defied the armies of the living God." Okay, we definitely can't gloss over the uncircumcised insult. So this is a common insult in the Hebrew Bible of other peoples, because the Hebrews set themselves apart by being circumcised. So whenever we hear someone talking about the uncircumcised, which we'll encounter again, they're basically mocking the other people as not being of their God. So here we've got a very bold statement by the future King David, but it's all talk. You can't compare David's youth as a shepherd with a guy who's been raised as a warrior, battle-hardened, and a good 1.5 feet taller than David, which is important when you're swinging swords and spears around, right? At any rate, when he talks about the lions and the bears, he's talking about Mideastern lions and bears. And let's talk about the Mideastern bear. This isn't a Kodiak. This isn't a grizzly. They were much smaller. Yeah, it took skill to kill, and yeah, they could kill you if things went wrong. But the images that us in North America might have when thinking about bears and of African lions, not quite the same thing going on here. I always imagine this as a little... as an adolescent kid with a cracking voice. "I can do it, King. Don't worry about me. I'm a man." It just really seems silly when you read the text in its context. But without any other options, Saul allows David to go, but encourages it to take his armor and weapons. But David refuses. He doesn't need any of that. He has God, and with God alone, he'll go forth. And David does go forth. He walks down. Goliath sees this pipsqueak coming at him in basically a loincloth and starts laughing and mocking him. In 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 43, Goliath says to David, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the wild animals of the field." But David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come to you in the name of Yahweh of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This very day Yahweh will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the Philistine army this very day to the birds of the air and to the wild animals of the earth, so that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that Yahweh does not save by sword and spear, for the battle is Yahweh's, and he will give you into our hand." Well, this just seems ludicrous. You could imagine what it seemed like to Goliath. But then David takes a stone, puts it in a sling, and starts swinging it. Let's go. Lets loose, and the stone hits Goliath and drops him dead. David walks up to the giant, takes his humongous sword, lifting it high over his head, and chops off Goliath's head and holds it up for the Philistines and the Hebrews to see. At this point, mass panic goes into the Philistines. If this little kid can do this, just imagine what the army behind him can do with the power of their God. It's a rich and wonderful story that well illustrates the idea that with God on your side, you can be the smallest and still be victorious. This is a very important message from the Duramistic history. A people have been kicked around by other empires time and time again. Ancient Israel was small. At times they make themselves out to look like the big kids on the block, but they weren't. But in this story, you get that idea reinforced. We may have been defeated by the Assyrians, by the Babylonians, by the Persians, by everybody around. But if we have faith, we can be strong. Out of the David and Goliath battle, David's stock soars. He becomes incredibly popular with the people and even more popular with Saul. Saul is elated at David's victory and promotes him to general. Now David has a very successful career in leading troops for Saul's armies. But this also comes with popularity that's unwanted. Let's take a look at the next slide. In 1 Samuel 18 we find David went out with the troops, and he was successful in every mission on which Saul sent him, and Saul put him in command of all the soldiers. This pleased all the troops and Saul's courtiers as well. When the troops came home, and David returned from killing the Philistine, the women of all the towns of Israel came out singing and dancing to greet Saul with timbrels, shouting, and sistrums. These are instruments. The women sang as they danced, and they chanted, "Saul has slain his thousands, David his tens of thousands." Okay, this is where you hear the proverbial needle on the record scratch and go off the record. What just happened? They're praising David more than Saul. Now, take this into the context of a king who is slowly losing his mind and is suffering from paranoia. This is huge. David hears this, and in Saul's deluded mind, he begins to think that David is trying to usurp Jonathan's heir and Saul's hold on the throne. Saul's insane idea that David wants to usurp the throne provokes Saul's anger, and this leads to a downward spiral and a horrible tragedy. Saul tries to have David killed, but David won't believe that Saul's really trying to kill him. Oh, he just slipped and didn't mean to hit me with that sword. Within the context, everyone's trying to get David to leave and protect himself, but David refuses until one instance in which when Saul throws a spear at David that narrowly misses him, David realizes. But even in hiding, David refuses to go against his king. David is loyal to a T. This is one of his great characteristics in 1 Samuel, is his loyalty. It's also a potential downfall, but it doesn't lead to his downfall. It bolsters him up as part of this big propaganda push that the authors are using. So within this, David goes into hiding, but he still sees Saul as his king and as a father figure. People are encouraging him when he can have the upper hand to take over and kill Saul. And he gets angry. Why would I do that? He's like my father. I love him. I know he's not right in the head, but there's no way I'm going to turn my back on him. And this just makes the tragedy all the greater. Saul is paranoid that David wants to overthrow him, and in this paranoia, Saul makes enemies of his people. The tragedy rests in the fact that Saul is looking to David as the enemy, when in fact the enemy is himself. Saul looks at David as the one who wants to usurp his throne, when in fact David is one of the few left who want him to stay in power. David is one of the few left that support him. But in his madness, brought upon by the evil spirit sent by Yahweh, he's blinded to all of this. And this will finally end in his demise. And here we come to the death of King Saul, as we see portrayed in this piece of art. Yahweh has left Saul. Samuel, who, although Samuel was very much against Saul being king, they do become friends. His friend Samuel has since died, and he feels alone. He wants to reach out for God. Saul is one of the few cases of people that reach out to God, and God doesn't offer a hand back. But without Samuel, he doesn't feel like he's able to. So he needs to find a way to connect with his friend Samuel, who is dead. So he turns to a necromancer. Necromancy is a form of prophecy in which one manipulates the dead. A necromancer might bring back various corpses to do their bidding, things like that, often considered a dark art. But it's not always unpopular, but at times it gets very unpopular in ancient Israel. And Saul has a persecution of necromancers at one point, where he has them rounded up and killed. So fighting a necromancer is quite hard to do, ironically. He needs one now, but he's had so many of them killed. But he learns of the presence of a necromancer in Endor, and he goes there to seek her counsel in bringing back Samuel from Sheol so he can talk with Samuel and figure out what's going on. Remember, in this part of Hebrew religion, they didn't yet believe in an afterlife in heaven with God. Everyone who died went to Sheol, including Samuel, and that's who's going to be brought back to the land of the living. Here, you can turn to 1 Samuel chapter 28, where we'll encounter the Witch of Endor. You get it? Witch of Endor? Okay, I'm sorry, I had to throw this in there. It's one of the highlights of the semester. All right, so in Star Wars Return of the Jedi, episode 6, you have the moon planet Endor, and here's one of the Endor shaman, Witch of Endor. Okay, you can go to the next slide now. All right, I love that last slide, but here's a more traditional viewing of the Witch of Endor. And here you have Saul, who has come to the Witch of Endor, who is presented here as a hag. I have a problem with that, and we'll get to that at the end of the story. If you would, take a moment to pause the slideshow and read 1 Samuel chapter 28, verses 3 to the end. That's verses 3 to verse 25. When you've completed that, please start up again and we'll discuss it. Okay, in the passage you just read, you get one of the great pieces of horror in the Hebrew Bible, in the Old Testament. When it's written down, it probably doesn't have the same effect as if you're sitting around a campfire and someone's telling it. But here's Samuel coming to the Witch of Endor, to the medium, to the necromancer. And she's hesitant to help this stranger who's disguised himself. And then when he calls for Samuel, she realizes who it is, and she's horrified. He reassures her. And there you've got the corpse of Samuel clawing and climbing its way through the dirt and the roots and the earth, getting back up to the land of the living from Sheol, and then standing before Samuel and delivering that chilling edict. You already know what's going on, my man. God has left you, and there's nothing you can do about it. And what's more, you are going to die. You and your sons with you, which will effectively cut off his line, and it's going to happen tomorrow. Which makes it even worse, because then you know the time. That's one of the reasons I would never want to go to a fortune teller, even if I believe that they worked, is kind of hoping for a surprise ending. Or at least I don't want to know now when it's going to happen. But at any rate, within this scene, you have Saul just wrecked by this news. Sure enough, there's no getting back with God. A very, very rare occurrence in the Old Testament. But there's no getting back with God, and not only he, but his children are doomed. But it's verse 20 that really piques my interest, that really gets my attention. Immediately Saul fell full length on the ground, filled with fear because of the words of Samuel. And there was no strength in him, for he had eaten nothing all day and all night. The woman, being the necromancer, came to Saul. And when she saw that he was terrified, she said to him, "Your servant has listened to you. I have taken my life in my hand, and have listened to what you have said to me. Now therefore, you also listen to your servant. Let me set a morsel of bread before you. Eat, that you may have strength when you go on your way." He, being Saul, refused, and said, "I will not eat." But the servants together with the woman urged him, and he listened to their words. So he got up from the ground and sat on the bed. Now the woman had a fatted calf in the house. She quickly slaughtered it, and took flour, kneaded it, and baked unleavened cakes. She put them before Saul and his servants, and they ate. Then they rose and went away that night. This is such an amazing thing that's happening here. Here you've got a situation in which this woman has been persecuted by this king. She's been chased and hunted down. She's probably had family and friends slaughtered by soldiers at his command. And when he receives this horrible prophecy from Samuel in front of her, what's her reaction? She doesn't cackle at him and say just desserts. No. She sees a broken man. She sees someone in pain. She sees someone who's just gotten the worst possible news, and she reaches out in love. A fatted calf, that's an incredibly valuable thing. I don't even know what to compare it to. A car? This incredibly valuable thing that she slaughters and makes food, nourishes him, helps give him strength for going on his way. Who's the one in the New Testament that's known for loving those who persecute him? Who's known for reaching out and giving gifts, offering comfort to those who despise him? Jesus. In many ways, this necromancer is showing Christ-like love, and this offers a valuable lesson. And it may have been a valuable lesson the Deuteromistic authors intended about the nature of rulership and what can be done, or maybe it's just something that we're picking up here. But it's quite often throughout history, and also in our present day, that rulers will choose an other to use as a scapegoat. They'll choose an other to be the vilified, the ones who aren't the right faith, the ones who don't believe in the right things. And they'll persecute them to gain popularity. Here we had Saul going after the necromancers. Was this because he was losing popularity due to his insanity and he knew that there were a lot of people who had problems with necromancers? Was it to gain favor with God because he wanted to impress God so he could get back on God's side and thought that God didn't like the necromancers? But here we find that such prejudices are false. The woman who is seen as the villain, the vile one, the one that the painter of this piece painted as a wicked-looking hag, is actually a beautiful human being who reaches out in kindness and tenderness to someone who doesn't deserve it. It's something to think about in the ancient history, and I would say it's something to think about today as well when we hear people in power using the other to boost up their poll numbers, to boost up their votes. Well, the prophecy comes to fruition. The next day, Saul is in heated battle and is not going his way. The Philistines attacked, killed his sons, which he saw, and he saw that he was surrounded and he was about to die too. So he asks his armor bearer, a position that used to be David's, to run him through with a sword so that the uncircumcised, as he says in the passage, can't make sport of him, can't make sport of his corpse, or torture him and do all those sorts of things. The armor bearer is horrified and won't do it. So David takes his sword, puts the hilt of it against a rock, and falls onto his own blade. This was a common form of battle suicide in the ancient world. The armor bearer, being horrified at what he's seen, does the same thing. Later, when the Philistines are going through and raiding the bodies for any valuables or anything that they can use, they find the king and make sport of him, chop off his head, dismember him, and tie him to their wall. But check out what happens after this. In 1 Samuel 31, verse 11, the verse that ends this book of the Old Testament. But when the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead heard that what the Philistines had done to Saul, to his corpse, all the valiant men set out, traveled all night long, and took the body of Saul and the bodies of his sons from the wall of Bethshan. They came to Jabesh and buried him there. Then they took their bones and buried them under the tamarisk tree of Jabesh and fasted 7 days. Here you have this king who is hated, this ruler who had become corrupt and ended up turning God away from him, and which led to his own demise. But the valiant men go to retrieve his corpse from the enemy wall. Can you imagine that situation? Can you imagine what a suicide mission that was? As if the enemy was going to allow them just to take their trophy. I'm sure the casualties were great, and I know that they would have anticipated this as warriors. So why? Why did so many give their lives and the rest risk their lives to retrieve the corpse of a king that had failed them? Perhaps it was that nonetheless he was their king and a symbol of their country. Perhaps it was that they understood that Saul never asked to be king. What does absolute power do? It corrupts absolutely. Here we had a boy who had lost his dad's goats, and suddenly he's tapped to be a king, not because he sought power, but because the people did. The people sought a king. Maybe these valiant warriors realized that Saul, a victim of his pride, was also a victim of their desire for a monarch to have over them. This concludes the book of 1 Samuel. It also concludes this part of our story. And with the conclusion, it raises a big question. Saul failed. The people wanted a king. They put one up, and it turned out just like Samuel had warned. But here at the same time, the Germanistic historians have been propping up David. The DH have been propping up David as this pious, humble, selfless man who was growing up to be the timber of a great ruler. In a way, the story is setting up. David, he's our man. If he can't do it, no one can. As we go into the book of 2 Samuel, they're going to answer whether or not he, or in fact anyone, can hold such power and remain pure.